good already. And now all we need to do is to add some padding here. And we can also make it round, of course. So as for the padding, let's try here half of the margin, 1.6 rem, and then the border radius of 50%. Let's give it a save, and beautiful. So that looks amazing, and yeah, this is exactly what we were going for. Let me inspect it here. And so, yeah, as I explained to you before, this will basically inline here this icon immediately into our page using that JavaScript code. And so here is that content that we defined and then the padding on top. So basically here in this element, I guess because it is like an element that was created by this script, so inside of this shadow root, the box sizing border box setting is not really working, right? And we can see that because we defined the width here as 32 pixels, and then we also defined some padding. And so that padding here was added on top, right? And so now the whole size of this is actually 64. And so that's exactly the behavior of the default box model without using box sizing set to border box. Okay, so just keep that in mind in case you want to use these icons yourself. But anyway, if we know that, then with this, I think we're good to go, actually. So this looks perfect, really, really nice. Also the spacing here and the visual hierarchy, everything looks good. And so we're almost finished here. And I say almost finished because there is still a small piece of content in our content file that we didn't yet put anywhere. And the one I'm talking about is back in the pricing tables, we had that sentence. Where is that? So prices include all applicable taxes. Users can cancel at any time. So let's grab this text right here. And where should we put it? So I think it makes sense to actually have it right here after these pricing plans and then before these here. So let's then add another container right here after this first grid and before the second grid. So our code is growing really a lot, so it's getting more and more confusing to find a place where we actually want to put our new code. Right. But anyway, let's use a container here. And then the content, we could just paste it here immediately, or we could put it into something like a paragraph, or even better, we can use the aside element. Now, you might think, well, we have used the aside for a sidebar, and this is nothing like a sidebar, right? However, that's not really the meaning of the aside element. So aside might be used for sidebars, but only if it does contain basically some additional but not crucial information. So that is exactly the meaning of aside. So its goal is to contain some information that is not crucial, but which basically plays a supporting role. And so that's exactly what aside is here. So this is like some additional information for the pricing plans. So I'm calling this the plan details. Now here, this users doesn't sound so good. It's better to speak directly to the user. So we can just say, you can cancel at any time. And to make the messaging here even a bit better, we can even include both plans also, or just include the following. And so the following is then these 4 features that we have next. And so with this, we kind of create a transition between these 2 bigger parts here. So let's also style that, of course. And this one, we're going to make it a bit smaller. Line height also 1.6. And let's align it to the center here, actually, because the two columns for the pricing plans, they're also kind of centered. Okay, nice. So this looks nice, but there is missing some spacing after it. And then here the space is actually a little bit too big. All right. Now, how are we going to add this spacing here? So inside of this section here, we want consistent spacing. And so what we can do, instead of now manually defining the spacing here on the plan details, we can simply make something which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but I think it might do. So I will simply make this a grid container as well, because by doing this, it will now also automatically get that space at the bottom of 96 pixels. Right? And it is no problem at all. So it is now a grid, but it only has one child element, and so it has basically just one column. And also we didn't even define the columns anywhere because we didn't put the grid and then something columns on there. And so this is just to maintain this same spacing everywhere. So if at some point in our design we decided to change this like to 6, then that would change everywhere. Okay? But putting it back, we can now see that here, of course, the spacing is way too big. So here we have what I call ambiguous spacing, because the spacing here is the same as here. And so here we have this small piece of content that we don't really know where it belongs to. And it does belong to this part here, of course. And so we do need to reduce now the margin bottom here. So for that, let's use some of our helper classes. So again, whenever we kind of want to override a default, we can simply do that with one of these. So let's use this one again that we have already used previously. And so this will then override everything because it has the important on it. So that is this one here with the pricing plans. Of course, without the dot. And there we go. So immediately we can now see that this belongs here. Right? I think that's really obvious simply by changing this spacing. And so, yeah, now we see that this margin bottom of 9.6 that we defined previously has been overwritten with this 4.8. All right. And I would say that with this, we finished yet another really beautiful section. So we took a lot of attention to detail, which I think is really important if you want to deliver good work. And yeah, I think we just did that here. So really nice job. I'm really happy to see that you are still sticking with me at this point here in this huge, huge project, which at many times might seem a bit complicated. But really, if you dissect everything, it is all just a matter of applying the design rules and applying all the CSS and HTML that you had already learned before. All right. And of course, I'm also teaching you a couple of tricks and techniques that I've been learning over the years. So things like using helper classes like this here to basically override some default setting that we set somewhere else. Okay. So using these helper classes here, these really are helpful for us. And so you should get used to doing that as well. Okay, but enough talking. Let's now move on to the next section. So, I mean, the next section, not in the course, but of this project, which is finally going to be the call to action section. So hopefully I will see you there soon. Hey there, and welcome back to the last section before the footer. And so this is finally the call to action section. So here we will basically create a form where the user can then start signing up for OmniFood. So we will have a field for the name, the email, how they found OmniFoot, and then also a submit button. Then before that, we will also have, as always, some heading and some text. And on the right side here, I actually want to add like a supporting image. So to make this form look a little bit more catchy, and yeah, in general, supporting images are many times a good idea. And so we'll just do that here as well. All right. So we're going to base this example on these standout sections that I've been showing you in the web design section. So just like that first example there. And then as for the form, basically I will make a form in a grid. So here a 2x2 grid, as you can see in my sketch here. Okay, so let's start doing this now. So adding yet another section here. So section CTA, which stands for call to action. Then this one, we also, just like all the others, or at least most of the others, we want it to be centered. So container, but of course it wouldn't have to be centered. So this is just the design decision that I took for this one. But if you wanted, you could also have a standout section that, for example, occupies like 80 or 90 or even 100% of the viewport width. But here, I just like to keep it centered like the rest of the sections. Okay, then here inside of that container, on the left side, we will basically have that form and also all that other content. So the heading and the paragraph text that I draw in the sketch. And so let's call this one here the CTA text box. And then the other one for the right side, which is where the image will live. So CTA image box. All right. And here we will actually, again, create our own grid because we want these two columns here, so these two elements, not to have the exact same width. But instead, the image should take up like 1/3, and then this other box here about 2/3 of the container. So let's give this here another name so we can style it individually. Okay, let's grab all of this here, as always. So CTA section. And so now that CTA, let's actually immediately work on what I just said. So making it a flex container, or actually a grid container. So of course we could also use flexbox, but well, as I said in the beginning, I'm simply choosing to use CSS grid for all the big overall page layout elements. And so I would say that this is one of them. And so yeah, using CSS grid for those and using flexbox for the small stuff. So grid template columns. And so as I said, I want this first box, so the first grid item here, to be 2/3 and this one 1/3. And so that's very simple. So the first one needs to be 2 FR and the second 1 FR. And so together they make up 3 FRs, and of those, 2 out of 3 are for the first one and 1 out of 3 are for the second one. And so that's then exactly 1/3 and 2/3 for the first one. Okay, so I hope that made sense. So let's check it out here in our page. And indeed, that does look as though this one here has 2/3 and this one here 1/3. Great, we're off to a good start, but since this is one of those standout sections, let's give it a background color. And I will actually use a gradient here, but for now let's just choose our regular brand color, and I will also add a box shadow to it. And here I will use the same one that we used for the meals, And again, that is just for consistency. So this one here. So maybe we will make it a bit darker, but we will use these same values here. And actually, let's copy that also here into our design decisions, which of course you don't have to do it, but just so we keep it consistent, we can then come here and copy that. So that's especially useful if our project is really big. So let's try that here, but probably we will have to make it a bit darker. Oh, and of course we cannot see much because the element is really small still. So let's for now add some temporary height here. So this is temporary. So height, let's say 50 rem. And so let's see now. And well, you can very faintly see the shadow here. Maybe in the screencast you cannot see it. So we will have to make it darker. And the reason for that is that the darker the background basically is, then the more dark the shadow also needs to be, because otherwise it will not be visible at all. So let's make it 0.15 maybe. And since we're here, let's also make the borders round again. So again, using the same 11 pixels as in the meal. And that already looks a lot better. So it's still quite subtle, of course, because that will always be the goal. We never want a dark shadow. Remember that? But if we turn it off, then it looks quite different. Right? And so it is definitely there, and we could maybe make it even a bit darker, but also I think it is okay like this. But anyway, let's now take care of that gradient that I was talking about. So what I want to do is to create a gradient that is darker on one side and lighter on the other side. So basically what I'm going to do is to use a lighter version of our orange here to use it on one side of the gradients. But first, let's remember here again how gradients actually work, just in case you skipped the first lecture where I first introduced this. Let's turn this one off. And now here, in order to specify a gradient, we use the background image property actually. So a gradient is basically treated as though it was an image. Okay. And so here we then write this function here. So linear gradient, and then we can specify two colors. So let's specify our regular brand color here first. Just like this. And then we can specify a second one. Let's actually do the second one first. And just for testing, I'm going to go with red here. Okay. So that is definitely a background, even though not a very pretty one yet. And you see that by default, the gradient flows from the top to the bottom here. Okay. But we can also change that here as the first value that we specify here, which is basically the degree. So we can say 90 degree here, for example, and so then it will flow from the left to the right. Okay, and if we say 180 degrees, then it will be again from top to bottom, which is basically the default. And then with 360 degree, then it should be the opposite. And indeed it is. Now, this is one way of doing it, but there is actually another one. So we can also basically do it using English language and writing something like to right. And so now it flows to the right. So from the starting color here to the right, all the way to the second color. And we can also say to the left. Then it will be the opposite direction. You see that? And we can also basically use corners. So we can say to right bottom. And so then it should start at the left top corner exactly here, and then flow to the right bottom corner as we just specified. And so let's actually leave it at this setting. All right. But here, of course, you could experiment with all the other values here as well. So here it could be also left, and here it could also be top. But now as for the second color here, let's get one of our tints. So this is the original one. So let's grab another one, maybe this one. So with this, I think we wouldn't have a big difference, but here it should then be noticeable. So just copy that, replacing the red with that new one. And yeah, I think that does look quite nice here. And so let's leave it at that. I will just copy this here into our designs. Okay. And so that's it for now for this part. So that's the entire CTA here. And now let's take care of this image here. Now, what I'm going to do is to actually now use a background image. So instead of specifying the image right here, I will use a background image, because that will then make it easy for me to overlay a color on top of it. So again, we actually already did that before, but I thought it was important to do it here once more. So let me copy these two actually. Or at least I will also already write this one here. All right. And now, as I was saying, let's specify the background image right here. So when we have an actual image, we need to use the URL function here. And the image we are looking for here is this one. So this, I think, is a very beautiful supporting image of a lady eating here, again, some nice food. And so this, once again, has the goal of making the user then really feel like they should be signing up for OmniFood. But here, specifying the path will actually become a little bit trickier. So let me show you why. So if we just specify, let's say, img, and then slash eating, like we have been doing before, so like this, well, then it shouldn't really work. So let me show you that on the page. And indeed, it is not here. So let me inspect that right here. And you see we have this red error. So if we click here to console, we will see that failed to load resource on eating.jpg. Okay. So let me show you why that is. Now VS Code somehow displays it here, but well, it is actually not correct. So the reason for this is that right now here in the CSS file, we are actually in this CSS folder. So in this one, right? However, writing it like this basically means that in the same folder that we are currently in, go into the image folder and then choose the image eating, right? However, inside of the CSS folder, there is no image folder. So it works this way with this path in the HTML, because in this file, we are actually like in the root folder. And so in this folder, there is indeed an image folder where the browser can reach into, right? But here again, it is not, because we are in the CSS folder. And so first we need to basically move out of the CSS folder into the main root folder. And then from there, we can reach into the image folder. Okay, so what we have to do is to write ... and then slash. So the ... basically means to go to the parent folder. So moving one level up in the file tree. And so then once we are back in the parent folder, then of course we can go into image and then this one here. So let's see. And here it is. All right. So hopefully that wasn't all too confusing. But just remember that whenever you need to go one level up, just use the 2 dots here before writing the rest of the path. And in case you need to go 2 levels up, you can just do this. Dot dot slash dot dot and then slash whatever comes next. All right. But anyway, let's now size the background. So background size, and here we use cover again, which will basically ensure that whatever is the dimension of this element, the background image will always cover it entirely. And so now that looks perfect. Right? So this here is the element, and without background size cover, it just looks wrong. Right? Now we can also position the background. So that's something that we haven't done before. So background position, and here, for example, we can try top, which I think is the default, or we can try bottom as well. Well, here nothing changes actually, because the image is already stretched as high as it can. But if we put it to the left, then apparently nothing changes, but in some situations it can be helpful to play around with this property. So let's just set it to center here. All right. Now we can try something else. So if this one here was really small, like just 10 rem, then of course there is not a lot of space for the image. And so then here, this property might become helpful. So without it being centered, it will automatically be aligned at the top, as I just said before. But at the center, it then moves here, and we can even put it to the bottom as well. And so that then only shows this last part here. Okay. But anyway, I will just put it here to center. And so that is how the image looks like in this situation. Now the image like this is way too bright and it takes up too much attention because it doesn't blend in very well with this side here of the container. So there needs to be a little bit more harmony, let's say. And so what I'm going to do is to overlay this same gradient that we already have here also on top of the image. All right. And again, we did that before, actually. And so let me just explain it quickly again. So in the background image property, we can actually define multiple backgrounds, which will then be layered on top of each other. And so here, what I'm going to do is to grab this one here, which remember is also defined on background image. So it also counts as a background image. So I can put that here first and then add a comma. And so now we have this image, and then below that, we have this one. Now, if we check it out like this, then of course our original image is completely covered because the image that is on top is not transparent at all. And so let's change that here. So I just hover it here. And then when I click here, it becomes this RGB value. And then I can simply move this one down. So for example, let's try, let's start with 50% maybe even. So clicking the title bar here and then dragging this one down. So starting with 0.5. And so now this is transparent. And so now the second background image that is underneath should be visible. And indeed, it is. Now this maybe is a bit too much color on top. Let's try 0.4. And maybe let's go even more down to 0.3 or 35. Okay, so like this, I think we're good to go. So that is very beautiful. Now we just need to get rid of this text right there. So here we don't need any text. And so basically here we will end up with this empty div element, which has no content at all. However, the problem with this is that visually, of course, this element still contains an image, but it is now completely inaccessible to screen readers. So this image right now is no content in our HTML, but instead only here in our style, which means that the image is really just aesthetical and really not a piece of content right now. And so that's why in screen readers, it will then not appear. We can and should, however, fix that. So we can use a new attribute that we haven't talked about before, which is called role. And so here we can now say that this div element acts as if it was an image. So the role here of this element is to be like an image. All right. And then we can also describe it, but not with the alt text. So this one here, alt, is only for images, but instead we can use the aria label. So this is like a newer attribute that is all about accessibility. And so here we can now describe that. So women enjoying food. All right. And so now screen readers will be back to understanding this as an image, and then they will read this text here to, for example, blind users or users with reduced sight. And yeah, we should never forget these users when we are building our sites. All right. And so that's why I'm placing some focus here on accessibility. Now, okay, now just one last thing here, which is, as you probably have noticed, these annoying bars on the side. Well, it's just one bar, but in reality, you can also see it here. So let me inspect that to show you where it is coming from. And indeed, it is coming from the container, which by default has this padding applied to both of the sides, right? That's also the reason why, if we look here closely, and it's easier to see like this, so you see that now the image box actually touches the sides here, and that this content is kind of aligned with this content. However, what we really want is for this box to be aligned with this content here as well, so that it appears to be in line with the other centered elements that we have on the rest of the page. So right now, it appears to be a little bit wider than this content and this. And so we want to fix that to make it look as though it was exactly as wide. So that is actually not so hard to do. We will just have to create a small trick, which, actually it's just this section here yet. So what we need to do here is to create another element which is inside of the container. And we will then have that element be the CTA. So let me show it to you. So this is now the CTA. And no longer this. Okay. And now, once we reload this, then that fixes the problem. So let me show you. Of course, the container still has the same padding as before, but now the CTA box, which is the box with the background color, is inside of that container. And so the padding of the container is then no longer affecting this box right here. And so right now it is actually aligned with the previous content. All right, so this is a lot better. It just creates this very small problem that this image here is overflowing the container. But once again, this is fortunately easy to fix. So here in the CTA element, which is now the new grid container, so this is where the image is overlapping. Well, we can just get rid of that by saying overflow hidden. Right? And so with this, it disappeared. Now, for some reason, we have this small gap here, like there's like a pixel or something there. And I'm not really sure why that is. So probably it has to do with some rounding issues here in Google Chrome, because this one is 0.66 pixel so 378.66, and this one, this first one, is 757.33. And so this might just be an issue of like alignment. So you see that as I scale it here, there are some situations in which it doesn't happen, and in others it does. So you see that it's kind of flickering. And so this is not a problem with our code, but with the browser. So there's nothing we can do about that. And actually right now it looks correct again. So I'm not really sure why that is happening. But anyway, we just need to ignore that. Great. So now we have this basic layout here finished. We have our background colors and our image here nicely aligned. And so now in the next lecture, it is time to finally fill this box here with some real content. In this video, we are going to work with form elements for the very first time. So this is going to be really interesting and important. So let's get started here. But before we work with the actual form elements, let's first place some other content here in this CTA text box. And first of all, we have, I think, some paragraph here. So here, this is the section where we actually get the instructions. So create a simple form for users to sign up. And then here is like some text, and this here what looks like a heading. So let's grab this and use it as a secondary heading. So H2, and so here we will again use the heading secondary, but this time without using first the subheading, because here we do not have enough space for that. Okay, and then below that we have some paragraph. Let's call it CTA text, where we can then place this. So basically one final text to try to convince the user. Now we offer a free sample meal. Sounds a little bit boring. So let's try something else. Get your first meal for free. Right. So let's check that out. And whenever we change the HTML, it then jumps back up on the page. But anyway, here is what we have so far. And well, first of all, we need to add some padding here inside of this box. And then what I can see immediately is that this text here looks a little bit unnatural on this background color, and especially this one here. But even here, it is a complete gray, of course, and the contrast with this background color is not perfect. Now we could leave it like this. It would be no problem at all, but I want to actually show you something here that we talked about in the color design lecture way back. So what I mean is that we can use a very dark shade of the background color for the text, basically. So instead of it being a completely unrelated gray color. All right, so let's do that and grab one of these colors here. And let's maybe try this one. All right, so let's set the color here on the CTA text box. And so then the CTA text will inherit it, but not this heading secondary, because heading secondary does actually override that. So what I'm going to do here is to use the descendant selector and say a heading secondary that is inside of the CTA should also have that color. All right. And now, since we're here, let's also add some padding here. So 6.4 rem maybe. Okay. Oh, and we can also dramatically reduce the margin to the bottom that the default heading secondary has. So let's say just 2 or 3.2 rem just like this. And that already looks a lot better, right? So it would be quite acceptable like this, but maybe it is still a tad too dark here. So, I mean, like this, it almost looks like black or still a normal gray. So let's try the next one here. So replace that in both places. And, well, maybe before we do that, let's also increase the font size here, because that will also help it make it look more normal. So let's actually select the CTA text and give it the font size of 1.8 rem and line height of 1.8 as well. And we are using this here so many times, the combination of these two, that we could almost make it into its own class, right? But let's not overcomplicate things here. Just keep it like this. And beautiful. So this looks really cool, I think. The color now is nicely integrated into this background here. Let's just see if this is also okay in terms of the color contrast. So getting this one here for the text, and then the background, well, it's kind of this one here at the top. So let's just try that one. And yeah, that is pretty good. And even if it was here a little bit darker, then we would still be fine. So that is in short. And so now here we have this working beautifully. Let's just remove some of the space in the top here, because having the big heading here gives it the impression that there is more space than there actually is. So we can reduce that a little bit on the top. Where? Right here. So we can step it down a little bit here. So the top, we can go one down to 4.8 rem, and then the others, we leave them at 6.4, all of them. Okay, nice. And so now it's time to actually start working on that form here. So again, that's going to be the very first time. So let's take care of that now. So right here after the text, we will now introduce the form element. Now the form on its own doesn't really look like anything special. It's really just a box, basically, for the input elements that we're going to use next. So we still need to format it. So let's give it the class of CTA form. All right. Let's close down the sidebar here again. And so now it's time to start using some real input fields. And for that, we can use exactly the input element. So input, and then the most important attribute that we need to set here is the type. So VS Code automatically gives us here a couple of different types. So probably that's actually all the available types. And the most common one is text. But you see that we have different types for password, for numbers, for uploading files, for emails. And so we're going to use a couple of these as we go here. But for now, let's use a regular text input field, which is the most common one. Okay. Let's do another one. Input. Let's try email now. Then next, we can also add a button, and we can do that in two ways. First, we can use input of the type submit, like this, but I actually prefer to use a regular button. So if we just use a regular button here and then click that button, the form will automatically be submitted. So let's just use the one that we already have used before. And let's say sign up now. All right. Now, of course, when we click on this button here at some point, then nothing will happen. So usually we will need some code on our server that is then ready to receive a submitted form. So with HTML, we can actually only collect the data, but we cannot like send the data anywhere, and we cannot receive it anywhere. So with HTML, we can only collect some data, but we cannot receive it anywhere. All right. So really on the HTML side here, this is just for receiving and for sending the data. And to send the data, we can define the action tag here, or the action attribute. And then we can set the URL of the place where the data should be sent to. And again, you would then need some code on your server that is ready to receive this data and which has a URL where you can send it to. But for now, let's just set it like this. But actually, by the end of the course, I will show you a great solution where we can actually make this form work. So without having to write any code on our backend, so on our server. Okay, but anyway, let's just take a look at what this very, very simple form looks like in HTML now. So in the browser. So indeed, we have two input forms where we can write, and we have a button. And then as we click this here, you see that we get this warning. And so that is because the browser knows that here we should have written an email. And the reason for that is that in our HTML code, we defined this as the type of email, right? And so that is very, very helpful then. Now here we can also make a couple of different things. So for example, we can define a placeholder. So placeholder, and then it is common as a placeholder to display kind of the format of the data that we want. So let's say John Smith. Now what many people do here in the placeholder is to actually give a label to the input. So instead of writing here John Smith, we could write also your name. Right? And then here it would become more obvious what you need to write here in this field. Then of course, as you write something, that will override the placeholder. But again, it is actually a better practice to here write the format of the data that you expect and write the actual label into the label element. So in HTML, we do have an actual label element which we use exactly for this. So let's say here we want the full name. Okay. So the label element is actually like a complete element with an opening tag, a closing tag, and the content. While the input element, as you might have noticed, only has the opening tag, but it has no content. So that's why it has this closing slash right here. Okay, let's try another label here. So email address. So let's actually also put a placeholder here, like me at example.com. All right. So there we go. We have our label here. And then besides that, we have the input field. And they are all side by side because they are all inline elements. So by default, all of them will not create a line break and will simply be placed one after another. Great. Now, another thing that we can do with labels, which is something that maybe you have experienced before while using the web, is that we can click on them and then the input field that belongs to it will become active like this. So that is something very common and it makes a lot of sense to implement this. So let me show you how. So here in the input, we can define an ID. So remember way back when we actually used ID to also select elements in the HTML. But we can use IDs for other things. For example, for what I'm going to show you now. So let's call this one here full name. And let's call this one here email. So not a class, but an ID. And so now here we can define the for attribute. So yet another new attribute. And so that's why learning forms can be a little bit of work because there's a lot of new stuff here all at once. But anyway, here now we can write that exact ID that we used here. And so with this, we basically link this label to this input. All right. And here, let's do the same thing. So this now is for the element that has the ID of email. And so again, with this, we linked these two together. And so now, when we click on this label, then you see how it automatically selected the corresponding input field. And the same here with the email address. Okay. And now let me just show you some more here, even though we are not going to need them, but I will still show you how they look like. For example, the checkbox, that's a very popular one, or also number. So here we have a checkbox just as expected, and then we can also create a label for that. And then when we click on the label, it will automatically turn the checkbox on and off. Then here, when we have a number, you see we have these small arrows here. And when we try to input a letter, well, that shouldn't work. And it doesn't work with most numbers. But with E, it does work because that's a special mathematical constant. All right, now let's turn these two off here with comments and move them down here. Because next, what I want to do is something different, which is a select box. So let's write select like this. And then in there, we can define multiple options. So for that, we use the option element. So more and more elements here. But anyway, this select here, I want to use it for the user to tell OmniFood where they heard about them. So actually, let's create first a label here. Oh, that's not what I wanted. So a label, where did you hear from us? And again, here we can give it an ID. Let's say select where. And then to connect them, we say for select where. So here, let's then add a couple of options like friends and family. And maybe that content is also here. No, it's not. So I will just come up with it here. But before I write the next one, we also need to define a value here. Okay, so I will explain a bit later why that is when we actually submit the form here. But essentially, here the value of this input field will very simply be the name that the user writes into the field. And the same here for the email. Now in the select, the value will then simply be what we write here. So for example, friends. And when the user then selects this option here, then the value will be friends. Let's just add another one here. Let's say YouTube. So YouTube video. So let's see it here on our page very quick. So here is the select box. And so if we select this one here, then the value of this field here will basically become YouTube. So the value that we defined on the option element for this one, right? And if we choose this one here, then the value of this input field or of this select element will become just friends. So exactly this value, right? Now the first one here should actually usually be basically an empty one. So not class, of course, but value empty, because here we can then write something like, please choose one option. And so since the value is empty now, we are then not allowed to submit the form with this one here being empty. Now let's duplicate this here a couple times. Let's say we heard from them in a podcast or a Facebook ad. And then also the others option, which we always have. And ad and podcast. All right, give it a save. And so here we have all of these. Okay. Oh, and actually we are allowed to submit the form. And that's because there is still more that I didn't show you yet. So we can define even another attribute on these elements here, which is the required attribute. So we already have ID, type, placeholder, and now let's add required. And this attribute for the first time doesn't need a value. So it's just required, and that's it. So let's add that, well, not to the label, but to the input. So let's make all of them required. So that works on inputs and also on select. All right. So let's try that now again. So if we click here now, then it says, please fill in this field. So just something, then please fill in this field. But then when I write it with the wrong format, it tells me to please include an at. So I do that. .com maybe, and if I try now, then it still doesn't work because this first default option here is empty. Remember that? So the value here was empty, and so we're not allowed. But if we then choose something, then the form will get submitted, basically. So it will be sent to this URL right here, which we defined. So this empty hash. Right? But again, more about that. So more about this action here a bit later. Okay. Now, right now, the way the form looks is a complete mess, right? So everything is just like one after another here without any structure at all. And so what we usually do is to always group the label and the input together in some div element or some other container. All right. And this one, I think, might not even need a name, so a class name. This is just to group them together a little bit. Because by doing this, we will then be able to also group them in that grid, like I showed you at the beginning. Well, not like... Oh, actually, we need it all the way down here after the select. And then let's also... actually place this one. And then this one, the button, I think might not need any container. So that should now look different because each of them should now be in their own line, right? And so that's because the div, of course, now created a block level element which creates a line break after it. So here we see again the label in action, and it works just fine. And so now, just before finishing this video, let's quickly format these 4 containers, or, well, these 4 elements here, into a nice 2x2 grid. All right. So that is the CTA form. Let's do that maybe here at the very end, because there will be a lot of styles after this one. So CTA form. Display as a grid. And they should have 2 equally sized columns, 1FR. And let's give them 2 different gaps, because remember, many times in the column we need a bigger gap. And so let's do that here as well. 3.2 rem maybe, and for the rows, 1 step down. So that is 2.4 rem. And then also to create some space between this paragraph and this form, let's just add some margin bottom here to this CTA text. Now we could also have wrapped this entire thing here again into like a header, but let's not do that right now. I will just add some margin here. So a bit more than here after the heading. So between the heading and the text, there is 3.2, and let's now increase it to 4.8, which is the next step. Okay. So that is not perfect, but it is looking a lot better than before. And so with this, we will now be able to style all of this in the next lecture. All right, let's now finish working on our form by now styling all the input elements. And the first thing that I want to do is to style these labels. So basically putting them on top here of the inputs and of course making them a lot bigger. Now notice how I didn't give all of these form elements here class names because they already have so many attributes, and so adding a class on top of that would make them even more confused. So that's why usually when I build forms, I simply select the form, and then from there I simply use the descendant selector. So CTA form, and so we will style the label. Let's duplicate this here. So we will also style the input and also the select element. And actually also here the button. So this button already has this class, but as you saw, it doesn't actually look like any of the other buttons. And we will see soon why that is, but you can, if you want, already start thinking about that if you feel like it. So anyway, we're going to start with the label, as I said, and to give it its own line, all we have to do is to set it as a block level element, right? So that will then put the label and the input each on its own line. Then let's increase the font size, of course, to something that we can actually read. And the font weight a little bit bigger, but not too overwhelming. So just 500. And a little bit of margin to the bottom. So that's a very nice improvement already. And of course, they still work as before. So moving back, now it's time to work on these ones here, and especially, of course, increasing their size. So increasing their width and also adding some padding inside of them. So first of all, we can give them a width of 100%, which will have them occupy their entire parent. Then let's add that padding that I just mentioned, but not too much, just 1.2 rem here, so 12 pixels. And then we can also increase their font size. So the font of the text that we will write inside of the input field. So that's a good start, I think, for now. And then from there we can improve it even further. Right? So this looks better already. But if you look closely, you will notice that the font family here inside of these two fields is actually different from this one here. So what this means is that these input fields, for some reason, do not inherit the font family from the body element where we defined it, right? So all of the other elements, remember, they all have the same font family because they simply inherited from the body element where we defined it. Right? But again, input elements and also this button here and also this select one here, all of them do not inherit that. All right. However, we can actually force these elements to also inherit the font family. So how can we do that? Well, there is yet another CSS keyword that we haven't learned about, and it is called inherit. So basically what this does is exactly what it says here. it says so that it should inherit the font family from whatever parent element is relevant in this case. All right. And we can use this in all kinds of situations. So not just for font family. But let's see. And notice how it is now really different. Of course, we can see that like this. So if we turn it off, see how it changes dramatically. Right? But as I was saying, we can use this keyword also in different situations. So for example, remember how here in the secondary heading, we set the color here to this one. So the same one that is already in its parent element, CTA text box. Right? Because if we didn't have this, then the heading secondary would simply use the gray color that it had before. Right? See that? So it is now again gray. However, we could also use color inherit here again, because CTA text box is the parent element of this heading secondary, in this case here, so the one that's inside of CTA. And so if then here we set color to inherit, it will automatically inherit that color. And so you see, now it's back to this color. And of course, if we set this one here to red, then all the text would become red. So this one, of course, and yeah, this one as well, because we forced it to inherit the color from its parent element. So a very, very handy and useful keyword that you should keep handy in your mind, basically. But moving on now, let's remove the default border that is present on all input fields, and also to decrease the contrast a little bit between the background color of the CTA box and the element itself, I will add some background color to this one. So just our very lightest version here. So here. And then also let's add some border radius. So we have been using 11 and 9 pixels. And for this one, I'm going with 9 because it is a smaller element. Okay. So that looks even better than before. Now there's just one small thing that we can do, which is to add a very, very small and very subtle shadow here to these elements, which is something that I like to do a lot on input fields. So let me just show that to you so that you can see the difference that it makes, which is quite significant, even though it is quite subtle. So box shadow, and of course, horizontally we don't want any, and also vertically just 1 pixel, and the blur just 2 pixel. And then let's make it black. Let's choose, well, maybe 10%. All right. And there you see it. So it's hard to see, but probably on your computer, you can see it just fine. And it does make a lot of difference actually here. All right. Next up, one thing that we can also style is the color here of this placeholder. So right now it looks quite dark. It almost looks as though this was the real content. So I always make this a lot lighter. And we can do that by using a new pseudo element. So CTA, form, input. So basically the same as here. And then we can select the pseudo element of placeholder. So this one. So remember, pseudo elements are basically elements that we can select and style, but which do not really exist on the page. So like a first line or a first letter, or, well, the placeholder. And so here let's use a light color, and it doesn't have to be accessible in this case. Let's just go with this one. So again, one of these simple ones to select, which has the exact same value in all the 3, and so therefore in all the 6 positions of the hex code. So that's a lot nicer. And now let's talk about this one here. So this box that opens up here actually depends on the operating system that you're using. So if you're on Mac, yours should look something like this, but on Windows, it will look completely different. And I believe there's not really a way of styling it. But of course, we can style this part here. And in fact, it is almost the same as the input itself, so as the input element. And so we can simply add that here to the list. So CTA form select. Okay. So nice. So it looks exactly like these two now in terms of size. It has the same shadow. And then when we open this now, it actually has the same width as the select element. But again, the colors and all that stuff here, we cannot manipulate. It will simply depend on the user's operating system. All right. Just one thing that you might notice here is that the text is completely black. And so once again, this one here doesn't inherit the color that we select for our document. And the same is actually true here. So if we write something here, notice how the text is completely black. And so we need to force the color here to also get inherited. Right? So just like we did with the font family, we are now also forcing the color to get inherited from the body. And so with this, well, actually it's not inherited from the body, but in this case, it is inherited from this CTA box here, where we set the color to this brown. And so indeed, here it is now brown. And also when we write here, it's no longer black. And now finally, let's talk about our button here. So this button here doesn't have any styling whatsoever yet, even though we did actually add the button class to it, right? So why is there none of the styles from this class applying to our button? Well, let's answer that by actually going there. And so here is the answer. So this style here, so this CSS rule only applies to buttons, so to elements with the class of button that are links. And so remember that this means that they need to have the href attribute, right? It also applies to buttons that have been visited, but of course that also doesn't apply to our button here. So this button here does not have any href attribute, and so therefore it is not selected by this and not by this. And so that's why it doesn't have any of these styles here. So to fix that, we can simply add that to the list here. So basically just the simple button, but without any of these pseudo classes. And so now it should get at least some styles. So that looks different, but of course, still far from being perfect. So first of all, let's remove the ugly border here. And we also need to give it the hand cursor. And so that we can actually also do here, even though these other buttons don't need it. But still, there's not a problem in putting it here for all of them. So no border, and the cursor should be the pointer. Let's just write that here for the BTN itself. All right. And also the font family, I'm not sure if it is being inherited. I think it does look like it is. We can just try it here. Font family inherit. But yeah, that does look the same, I think. But anyway, let's actually leave it there. All right. So that's it for the button. So for the general styles for this button. And so now we can come back here and add some more styles here to really fit it to our specific needs in the form. Or we could also give it here another class and style it again in the general. So for example, if we had another form somewhere else, we could then reuse that button there. And actually, let's do that. Let's call it button form. So we don't need this one, and we don't even need the select one because it is already here. So let's do that after all these. So button form. And here what I want to do is to use the exact same background color as we have here as the text color. So not that orange, because that of course would become invisible on the already orange background color. So here we just use this one. And I think I haven't yet added that to our list. No, I did not. Okay. Then for the color, to not contrast too much with it, because right now it's actually black, so we need to set it anyway. But let's not set it to white, but to this very light orange. And then we also need to now change the padding. Well, actually, let's do that later, and let's check it out now. So it looks like this. And why do you think that the button is so high? So basically that it is occupying all this space. Well, the reason is that this button is right now a grid item, right? And by default, grid items stretch to occupy the entire grid cell. Remember that? So that's important to know, because this is the reason why it looks this big. So let's try to fix that by vertically aligning it here to the end, because what I want to do is to give it the same size as this input field here, and having it also aligned here to the bottom with it. So not to the top, but really with this one here. So let's try that with align self. So align self, because this is a grid item, and to vertically align items, we use the align items property. But here we don't want to set that on the container, but simply on this button. And so that's why it's align self, just as we have learned many times before. So setting it to end should move it down there. Yeah, nice. But it is still a bit bigger than this one, because by default, the button has some padding. So the padding right now is coming from right here. So top and bottom, the padding is 1.6, but on the form elements, so on the inputs, it is only 1.2. And so if we set the padding to 1.2, this one should then have the exact same size. So let's do that here. Padding 1.2 rem, and the other side doesn't really matter because it will also stretch all the way. So let's just put it at 1.2, and there we go. So that looks a lot more natural, doesn't it? Having the exact same height as this one. So really, really nice, really beautiful. We're almost ready here. There's just one important thing, or actually two or three, but what I just remembered is that we need to get rid of the fixed height that we set for this container. So way back in the first lecture, we set the height here to 50 rem. So we need to remove that now, because of course we want the content to dictate the height and not have it fixed. So remove all that, and that is a lot better. So now the spacing here is the same all the way around this form element. Next up, let's take care of the hover state on this button. So that's button form. And here let's actually change the background color to white. And then the color itself, let's make it the default color that we have been using all along. So 555. And the transition is not necessary to define because it is already here, which the button is also part of. Right, and so this should be enough to make this effect work. Oh, and actually it did it like permanently. So let's see what's happening here. So that's some kind of conflict between our selectors right now. Oh, actually we just forgot to write hover here. So no conflict after all. So now it should work just fine. And yes, beautiful. So almost ready here, but just one final thing, which is these so-called focus states. So when I click here, you see that this gets focused. So that's this blue ring here around this form. And the same is true here. Well, not here. Well, actually, yes. And the same here as well. And actually, it should also happen. Well, actually not, because once we click them, we move back to the top of the page. But if on the keyboard we hit the tab button, then you see that they also get focused. And as I hit again, it moves to the next link, and then all of them get this blue border. And that's because of accessibility, because having this outline around the currently selected element makes it easy for users who can only use a keyboard to navigate the page. So now when I hit tab again, it will move to the next one, and then I know exactly which is the currently focused field, right? And the same also for the button. Now, many people think that this outline looks ugly, and it is true that by default, the default one looks quite ugly. And so we can actually remove that default one, which is what in the past basically everyone has been doing. So also here in our general, let's go here to the end. And so what we do is to select every single element, and then on the element, we can use the focus pseudo class. So focus is a little bit like link or visited or hover. It's just another state, while in this case, it is just focus. And of course, we could define this here individually on links or on buttons or really anywhere. But when we want to set the same focus style basically everywhere on the page, we just do it right here. So it's a little bit like the global reset, but for focus states. So that blue focus state that we see outside the input elements and links is because of a property called outline. So that's another new property, and this one is similar to a border, but it is basically more outside of the element, and it's also not part of the box model. So what many people have done in the past is set outline to none and call it a day. But that, of course, is an accessibility nightmare for people who rely on just using their keyboard. So you see that indeed the outline is gone now, but as I navigate the page by hitting the tab key on the keyboard, I don't really know where the focus state is right now. So I tapped it again, but where is it? Is it maybe here or here? And if I tap it again, well, it somehow goes back, but we don't really know where it is. So I keep tapping it, but where is the focus state? So that is really, really bad for accessibility. So please never do this. So just setting the outline to none. So instead, what we can do is to still leave the outline at none, but then show the user some other kind of focus indicator that looks a bit nicer. So one that we actually like. Now there are multiple ways of doing that. So we can actually still use the outline property, for example, a dotted border, because we can style outline just like we can style border. So we can say 4 pixel dotted, and then this one here, and then we can even define an offset. Let's say 8 pixels. Okay. So let's see what happens then with the focus states. And so that looks like this. So you see, now it's here, then I hit tab again, and so it keeps moving from one link to the other one. So that's the 4 pixels dotted, and then with the outline offset of 8 pixels. However, what I don't like about this is that it doesn't wrap around here the rounded borders of the elements. You see that? So it's basically still just a square. And here, that's not a problem. But then here, again, it doesn't look so nice. And so there's actually an even better trick, which is using a box shadow. So let's turn this one off and this one off, and instead use a box shadow trick here. So this trick is going to be similar to what we did before with this outline button here. So remember, here we used it to add a border inside. So we set everything to 0 and then just set here the blur or the spread to something. So here we're going to do the same, but without it being inset. So still outside of the element, not inside. But still, it's going to be 0 in all directions. Also no spread, but just scale it a little bit. Let's say also by 8 pixels. So 0.8 rem. And then as for the color, let's actually try also this one, but maybe with some transparency. So I click here the top, and usually it should be black. There should be some black text. And now let's set it to like 50%. And so you will see that this is going to look a lot nicer. So you see that? Now here it's actually quite invisible, so we will have to fix that so you can barely see it. But now here it is actually quite visible, and this looks a lot nicer because it does wrap around these corners, because in the end it is really just a box shadow. Now down here in the form we will have to change it, for example, to a white color. So let's do that. So I will just copy this code and go here and define that here by the very end. So inside of the CTA, I can then still select everything and make the focus a bit different. So this we don't need. And let's use our very, very light orange. So that is, well, it's this one here. Somehow it wasn't on the list. But of course, we still need to give it some transparency. And let's again try 50%. And so we're almost done here. So you might think that this is a small detail that we should not worry about, but actually accessibility is really important. So these focus styles are really something that you must define in your own page. Unless, of course, you want to keep those ugly looking blue outlines. But those one I don't like, and most people don't like them as well. So we just do something like this. And so now this is a beautiful outline here. And it makes the focus state really visible and helps the user know where they are right now on the page. All right, and that's it. That's all I had to show you for forms and for formatting them. Now, there is a lot more things that we can do and that at some point you might have to learn. For example, how to format checkboxes, which are quite common as well. But that is a bit outside of the scope of this course because that is actually a bit tricky. Checkboxes are very hard to style, and so yeah, I'm leaving that for another time, let's say. All right, so this is the basics that you need to know to get started with building your own forms. And so hopefully all of this made sense to you so that now you can start doing just that. Awesome. So with this, we are almost finished with our project. All that is left to do is to build the footer. So this will be the last part of this section. And So if you're ready for that, let's go there now. Welcome to the very last section of the Omnifoot website. And in this one, we're going to build a really professional looking footer like this one. So we're going to use this design example from the right side to build a somewhat similar looking footer. So in the first column, we will also have our logo, then some social links, and a copyright notice. Then in the second column, we're going to have some contact information, so of the Omnifoot company, and then in the remaining 3 columns, there will be some additional links. So a bit, again, like here in this design example on the right side. Okay, so 5 columns and a really professional looking footer. And so let's get to work and build this. Okay, and so to mark up this footer in the HTML, we're going to use the footer element for that. And we will put it not inside of the main element, but actually outside of it. So right here. Because remember that the main area of the website is for non-repeated content. And the footer, as well as the header, we might repeat them exactly the same on some other pages that are part of the overall website. And so, yeah, the main part is really only for the part that is specific to this particular web page. Okay, so again, the footer and the header, they might be repeated on other pages in case there were some. And so they are not the main content of the page. So giving it the class of footer here, just like I did in the header. And then here we will also want some centered container. And so for that we use, of course, our container class. And let's also use a grid. And I think right now we don't have a grid yet with 5 columns. So let's create that really fast here. And of course, that's really simple. We just copy this and change this to 5 and this to 5. And so just like this, we now created a grid which has 5 equally sized columns. Okay. So this first one here is going to have the logo and the copyright notice and all that. So let's call this one here the logo column. So let's just write that here. Then the second one is for the address. So I'm calling that one address column. And I'm not sure yet if I will even need these class names. But many times as I write the HTML, I try to immediately name it. So let's just take a look at our content here again. So yeah, so here is that contact information. So we will write the address, the phone number, and the email. So right here into the address column that we just created. And these social links here, they will go into the first column. Then finally, we have also some additional links right here. So this huge list here. And so let's try to separate this into some different, basically topics. So create account, sign in, and these applications. And so I think that we can say that these links here are all about the user's account. So I'm going to basically create a subsection of the navigation called account. Then these 4 here are about the Omnifoot company itself. So basically a page describing what Omnifoot is, then Omnifoot for business, and partners and careers. And then finally, here are some resources, for example, where the user can find a directory or some other help. So here is where we will have now 3 columns, 1 for each of these sub-navigations, let's say. So let's create 3 more columns here. And I'm going to call this one here a nav call. And actually, since this will be basically a navigation, let's use the nav element here. and then 2 more. So 2 and 3. So this is just so we can see something on our page right now. But before we go check that out, let's, as always, add some padding here to that section first. So copying that once more, then footer, and here footer as well. So let's see. And there it is. So there are our 5 equally sized columns. So let's now add the actual content here very quick. So here we want the logo, and so let's actually get that from the header. So I'm going to go all the way up, and I noticed we have together here written over 600 lines of HTML code. So that's really a great job. But anyway, here is that logo. But before I copy this, let me actually wrap it into a link. So into an anchor tag, which is something that we do all the time with logos in the header. And so this will be so that when we click that logo, we will go back to the top. And this is something that we will implement a little bit later. So for now, let's just say nothing here. So going nowhere. And yeah, let's just check this out here in the top now. And you see it looks exactly the same, but it is now a link. And so when we click this, we go basically back to the top, right? And so now we will want the exact same thing also in the footer. So later we will then implement some smooth scrolling functionality, which will happen once the user clicks this logo. All right, here let's just give it a class of footer logo, let's say. But the rest here of the image can stay the same. So we are actually reusing this logo class here because I think that the size of it is also good for the footer. So here, I think this doesn't look too big. And so we can use that exact same class that we also used in the header. So that is basically now reusable. So, well, we could move that class to the general.css file, but let's not do that right now. So instead, what I want to do next here is to add that paragraph. And actually before the paragraph, so between the logo and the paragraph, is where I will want to put these icons for social links. So like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and all that. But I'm going to leave that for a bit later. So copyright, and then let's just write some standard copyright text here. So copyright, and here let's use yet another HTML entity. So the copy one in this case. So as you can see, it will create this copyright sign. So that looks quite nice. And then let's say 2027. And hopefully by the time you're watching this video, this year is not correct. But we will also fix that later, actually using JavaScript. So I will show you how we can actually very easily keep that year up to date. So just all rights reserved, even though this doesn't mean a lot legally, but it always looks nice, I think. Okay. So again, we're leaving the social links for later. And now let's take care of the address here. All right. So let me grab that here. And so of course we will not just paste it here and leave it like this, but instead we need to wrap it into some elements. But before we do that, let's actually also add some kind of header here to this column. But once more, for that, we will actually not use an H element, but simply a P element like this. So this is not really a new section, so it doesn't deserve basically its own actual heading element. So that would semantically not be really correct. So contact us. And then below that, we can wrap this entire information here into a special HTML element called address. So this element is basically for contact information of the page. So it's exactly what we are looking for here. So contacts. And so now let's wrap each of these here into a paragraph. Now, of course, we will not literally write address here because, well, this is pretty obvious that it is an address. We could use maybe some icon, but even that is not necessary. Okay. Now this phone here is for the next one, which we also don't need. Okay. So let's create one paragraph for each of them. And now here, let me show you something cool. Because here we can now basically make this phone number also a link. So let me grab that here. And then we can create a special kind of link. So we can write tell and then colon and then here the phone number. And the same for the email. And I will then show you soon what this actually does. So here instead of tell, because it's not a telephone number, we can write mailto. So this is now the href, and it's also the text that we want to show up on the page. All right. So let's check that. And well, if we click this now, then since we're on a browser, nothing should happen. Or let me see. Oh, actually it's trying to FaceTime it now, which is basically a way of making a phone call. And if I were to click here on this email, then it's probably going to open up my email program. And you see that it did, and it is trying to write an email to hello@omnifoot.com. All right, so that's exactly the href that we defined there. Right, so it opened the email program because of this mailto here, and it opened the phone application basically because of the tell. And so this is not really that helpful, maybe on a computer, but on a phone, when you tap a link that is formatted like this, it will then very easily make a phone call to this number. Now you noticed that these two links here are side by side. So let's add a line break there. And I'm actually not sure if we have done that before, but anyway, the way we manually add a line break is by using the BR element. So that stands simply for break. And so now they will be in two different lines here. Okay, so that looks perfect. And so let's move on to the next column here. So let's grab these 4 here. Yeah, so right here. So let's add here another footer heading. And this one here, remember, we said was about the account. And now let's create the actual navigation. And do you remember how we did that in the header? So we did not simply add a bunch of links one after another, right? But instead, what we did was to structure them nicely using the unordered list. And so let's call this one here the footer navigation. And then in there, of course, a bunch of list elements. And let's put these here. And of course, now inside of these is where we will put the actual links. So again, exactly like we did also in the main navigation that's on top of the page. So this one is for create account. And then let's simply duplicate this a couple of times. Then here is the iOS app, and it's even easier to write it than to copy it. And the Android app. So let's see if that looks correct. And it does indeed. So now we have a nice and structured navigation list right here. And so let's do the same for the other two. So in fact, I will simply copy this entire nav and then replace these two. All right, let's get the next four. So that's the first. Then here is for business. And finally, careers. Oh, and here we also want to change the title to company. All right. Oh, actually, this is what we wanted in this one. So let's grab all of this and move it up there. So I just cut it and paste it here. And now let's get the last three from here. Help center, and of course the privacy and terms, which are very important on basically most websites out there. And I didn't cut it here. And let's just call this section here the resources. All right, let's go back down, and here we go. So that looks nice, except of course for all the formatting, but the content is already here. So all the content except for those social icons that I mentioned before. And so let's now add them here between the logo and that text. So let's do that now. And once more, we can consider that a list of links. And so once again, we will use the unordered list for that. So calling it the social links. And since they are links, let's create again an anchor element. And now we just need some content in this link. So what is that content going to be? Well, we're going to use some icons here for each of the social links. So one for Instagram, I think. So Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. So let's actually get that here from IN icons, because these usually have all the social links included. So Instagram, and there we go. So let's click to copy. And so that should now be there. And indeed, it is. So let's just do the same 2 more times. So Facebook, and probably the next one we can already guess. So here actually we can just replace Instagram with Facebook, and here with Twitter. That should work. And yeah, those are the 3 we were looking for. And so with this, we finished the content part. So the HTML is written here for our footer, but of course it doesn't look anything like professional yet. And so let's take care of writing the CSS in the next and final lecture of this section. All right, so let's now style all the content that we have in our footer. And I'm going to start with these headings here, and then also with these entire navigation blocks. So that's footer heading. And of course, let's make it a bit bigger and also bolder. But maybe not too bold, so just 500. And then some margin to the bottom let's say 32 pixels here for now. And then let's also style the navigations here. So footer nav. So of course, getting rid of those bullet points first. And yeah, then let's first actually style the links themselves. So we didn't give them any class name, but let's do that here. So I will select, or I will add multiple cursors here, again using that trick of hitting Alt or Option at the same time as clicking. And then we can simply say class footer link, right? But of course, you can also just write it in one of them and then copy this class to all the other links. So footer link, add link, and also as visited. And as always, getting rid of the text decoration first, making it also a little bit bigger. So maybe one step smaller than the heading, so 1.6. Let's also make it really, or well, not really light, but quite light. And I'm not sure what colors we have been using here. I will just write this one here, this gray color temporarily. And then let's see what we have in our general color file. So here we have this 6F gray, but that's a bit too dark maybe yet. So I know that here in the visited section, I think we used 777. Or actually here, yeah, in the featured in section. Oh, and actually I just remember that we used 888 there, which was probably not really accessible. So let's just copy that here, just so we know that also. And I'm just going to test if that works. So if that is accessible, so 888, 888, and not really. So let's try 777 maybe. And that's also not good, but almost at 4.5. So let's make it a bit lighter. Oh, so 767676 is enough. And so let's use that one. So putting that right here, basically from darkest to brightest. So this is the lightest grade allowed on white. So like this. So let's copy that and let's use that one here, because these links, they should not really have a big impact. So they should be as light as possible, which, as you will see now, is still not really light. So you see, that is perfectly visible, but it is still a tad lighter than the rest of the content. And that will be especially visible once we actually style this one here. And even now, you see that this here is the normal 555 color. And so this creates now a visual hierarchy just as we want it, right? So here we don't want to draw a lot of attention. And so therefore we didn't use the 333 color on those one. And so if we just left this one here at 555 as well, then we wouldn't have any visual hierarchy in terms of colors. But anyway, let's go back and let's style the hover and active states. And so here I will now make them darker, going back to normal. Let's also add our usual transition of all, let's say, and then 0.3 seconds, which is, I think, is what we have used all the time here. Now, finally, let's also take care of the spacing between the links. And so once again, there are two possibilities here. And the first one would be to add some margin bottom to these links here, or maybe even to these list items here. And then on the last one, we would take away that space and set it back to 0. So that's the first option. And the second option is to do what we also did before, which is to make this footer nav here a flex container and change the flex direction to column. And so then we can apply the gap property, which makes this a lot easier. So display, flex. And so just to show you once again that like this, all the elements would try to appear side by side. And then we change it back to a column. And so now we can add a nice gap, for example, of 2.4 rem. So let's see, and that looks really nice. The animation also works, and here we could maybe even use some more spacing. So after these headings, let's set that to 4 rem even. So here we can use a lot of spacing. That looks quite nice and professional in a footer like this. Okay, next up, let's move here to this first column. And so I'm going to start by styling this navigation here. So the first thing that we can do is to actually also add this footer link class, because these are in fact also just links, right? So these three. And so that should then already change some of the things there. Yeah, so they got bigger and the color has changed. And even the color animation, so that transition is already there. But of course, we want them to be a little bit bigger and also side by side. So let's grab the social links class and let's put that first, just as it appears also in the HTML. So actually right here. So of course, no list style. And to make them side by side, as you could have guessed, we use flexbox. And then let's add a gap of, again, 2.4 rem. Okay. And now I think we just need to make them a little bit bigger and also add some space here, of course, after this logo. So that's actually this link here. So this footer logo. So that's here. And first of all, if we want to add some vertical spacing, we need to make this a block level element, because a link, remember, is just an inline element. But it needs to be block if we want to use the complete box model on it. And so the box model includes, of course, the margin property. So let's say 3.2 rem here. And now just to make these bigger, let's select them, giving them a new class name, social icon. And here we could also have used the descendant selector, basically selecting the ion icon element inside of the footer link. So that would have worked just the same, but well, there are always many different ways of achieving the exact same thing. So here let's go with the standard size of many icons of 24 pixels. So height and width of 2.4 rem. Nice. That looks very beautiful, very nice. And so next, let's take care of this copyright text. And this one, let's make it even smaller than the links. So the headings were 1.8, the links 1.6. Let's go one step down here, 1.4 rem. And also the color here should be quite light again. So I'm consistently going to use that lightest gray color here. So this one. So just the one that we used also here for the links, just to keep the colors consistent here in the footer. Let's also add some line height. 1.6 maybe. And so let's check that out. Okay, so we have this content here now in 3 lines, and that's a bit too much. It should just be 2 lines, but let's fix that in a minute. For now, I also want to change the spacing here. Now, how could we do that spacing? Of course, there are, as always, many different ways. So we could manually try to add the right spacing here to the top of the copyright or to the bottom of these icons. So trying to maybe align this line here with the rest of this footer. So making it appear like down here. So if we inspect this footer here really quick. Yeah, so basically trying, you can even turn this on. So basically trying to push this content here all the way to the bottom, right? So basically what we could and should try here is to maybe push this element here all the way to the bottom. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to use again that trick that we used before in the app layout. So that's way back in the last section where we created one element that was basically pushed all the way to the right side in that example. And for that, we used flexbox together with margin auto. Remember that? So if not, that's not a problem because now we will do it again. So first of all, let's then make this logo call here a flex container. So logo call, actually we haven't selected that yet. So display, flex, and then of course we also need to change the flex direction to column. So for now, of course, everything still looks exactly the same, right? So here you have the flex container with the 3 elements. But now if we add a margin top of auto to this paragraph here, it will be all the way to the bottom. So it will be pushed right here because it will create automatically the right margin to the top. So let me show that to you. So here in the copyright, we can now say margin top of auto. And so there it is. So let's see. And so you see that the margin here is exactly 45 pixels. And so that is just what is necessary to basically push this here all the way to the corner. So all the way to the end of the element. And if this element here, so the entire footer, if it was higher, then of course the margin here would not be 45, but it would automatically be figured out to make this content appear at the bottom. Okay, so this is really an amazing flexbox trick that many people actually don't know, and it works both horizontally and vertically. So we used it horizontally in that app layout, and so you can go back there and see how it worked there. And here we did it now, of course, vertically. Okay. But anyway, let's now work here on that second column. So on that address. And so here we actually have some more links. And so we can again use that class that we already created so that all the links that we have in the footer look the same. So that's important for consistency. So if we check that out now, then, well, that didn't actually change. Oh, and of course, that's just because I copied the wrong thing. So I was distracted apparently. So of course I don't want social icon, but I want footer link. And so now that starts to look good already. Now all of this here is currently italic because that is simply the default formatting of the address element. And so we need to first of all fix that. So that's here this contacts element. So let's add that right here after the, yeah, right here maybe. And so we need to set the font style back to normal. And then let's also set the font size to 1.6, just like the links, and give it a line height also of 1.6. So that should look good already. And now all we need to do is to add some spacing here to the bottom of this first paragraph. Okay, so that's this one here. Let's call it the address, or we could also have simply selected the first paragraph child of contexts. But well, that's not a big difference. Or also we could have added a helper class. So once again, many different ways of solving the same thing. Okay, nice. However, what we notice here is that we have some content overload basically here on these first two columns. So this content here has been wrapped into 3 lines and the same here. And it would be a lot nicer if we just had this in 2 lines. And so then the content would look a lot less dense here. At the same time, here we actually have a lot of empty space. So here between this column and this one. And so these columns, they are actually a bit too big for this content here, and they are a bit too small for these 2 columns right here. Now, of course, we could leave it like this. It would not be a problem, but let's make this a bit nicer and fix this problem. So these equally sized columns have served us well up until this point, but now let's actually create basically another grid here. So replace our existing grid and make it so that the first 2 columns are a bit bigger than the 3 other ones. So let's come up here where the grid is placed in the HTML. So that's the grid 5 calls. Now I will of course not change this here. So this class will be the same because the rule is basically that in these types of classes, so grid 2, 3, 4, and 5 calls, so these here, that the columns are always equal sized. So that's just basically a rule that we create for ourselves. But here again, what we want is different. So let's create basically a grid just for the footer. Let's call it grid footer with 2 U's, of course, or O's. So grid template columns. And so now we need to experiment around a little bit here. So let's start by making them double maybe. So 2FR, 2FR, the first 2 ones, and then the other ones, each of them 1FR. And so now here we replace that. And so let's see. All right. Now these columns here, they are a bit too small, I would say. So here, there's now a lot of empty space created here, and so that's also not necessary. So like this, the columns are too wide, so let's fix that. So instead of being 2, let's make them 1.5 maybe. So basically just a small difference. And what this will do actually is that these 2 here will be 1.5 plus 1.5, so they will be 3 FRs overall. And then the other 3 will also be 3 FR. And so that makes it so that these 2 columns here, which are different, are going to take half the width of this footer. And then the other 3 are going to take the other half. And so I think that's a nice idea here. So 3 FR for the first 2 and 3 FR for the 3 last columns. And beautiful. So like this, I think it looks really nice and really balanced here in terms of spacing. All right. So with this, I'm quite happy. And all I want to do now is to add a little bit more spacing here maybe. So the footer should be quite a distinct part of the web page. And so let's add even more spacing here on top and on the bottom. So let's see what we have after 96. That's 128. So let's go with that here actually for our padding. So 12.8 rem. Okay. And very nice. And now I think we just need to create a small visual distinction between these two sections here. So we have, of course, this one here, which makes a huge impact, but then we have the footer afterwards, and there is not really a transition. So that's partly because they have the exact same background color, and maybe also because there is not enough spacing between them. So one thing that we can do to fix that is to add a very small and subtle line here, basically separating these two sections. So like a very, very light gray line going from one side to the other, but even that subtle line will then create some kind of distinction here. So let's try to add that on the footer. So really on the footer, so that it really goes from all the way to the left to the right side. So just like the background color. So border top, 1 pixel, solid, and let's try something very light. And again, FFF is the lightest, and so to make it a bit darker, we can try, for example, DDD, which is like 2 letters above that. So let's see, and that is a bit too dark, actually. So that's not the subtlety that I was looking for. So let's try the intermediate one, so EEE. Okay, and this one I think looks great, actually. So that's really subtle, and still it creates some distinction here. Now we just need to make the spacing between this one here and this one the same, because like this, it looks a bit off, right? So I'm sure you can see that as well. So what I'm going to do is to add this 12.8 padding of RAM to the bottom of this section right here. So now top 9.6, then 0, then 12.8 RAM, and then 0 on the other side. And actually, we can omit this last value. So I'm not sure if I mentioned that before, but usually the order, as we already know, goes like this. So top, then right, then bottom, and then left, right? However, we can also just write 3 values. So then it goes top, then the one in the middle is the horizontal spacing, and then the last one is the left value. And so what this means is that we can basically just omit this last value here, if it is the same, of course, as this one. Right? So let's see. And now, because we changed that spacing, the line is exactly between these two sections. And so that looks great now. Now, since we were changing here the spacing, I think that here we do have way too much spacing actually. So this section here, I want it to be closer to this previous one, to basically continuing the flow of the user trying to sign up here. So let's reduce that to half, so 4.8 RAM. All right, and so I think we fixed that as well. And so now if we come here and keep scrolling down, then I think the flow here is a little bit better. All right, but going back to our footer, I think that we actually finished it. And so with this, we actually now finished the desktop version, so basically the big version of our OmniFood website. So congratulations, really, really well done. And it's really nice to see that you're still with me here and that you made it all the way to the end of this project. So this was a huge project. So in fact, we did write like 600 lines of CSS here, you see. And here in this one, even more, or actually a bit less, but almost 300 as well. So together, that's almost like 1,000 lines of CSS. So really great job. And that's a huge achievement for your very first big project. However, of course, the project is not yet done here. So that's because, as I mentioned right at the beginning of the project, the next step is to now make it responsive. So make it adapt also to smaller screens that are smaller than simply this. So right now, if we scale down here our page, then you will see that it will immediately start to break and look really bad in many places, right? So here, for example, this is of course completely unacceptable, right? And also here, things are really starting to break down. And even worse, if we make it even smaller, right? Oh, actually, I'm noticing here that we didn't finish the navigation yet. So let's quickly do that. So I said we were already done, but in fact, we are not. So let's see what sections we want here. And there's not a lot to choose from. So let's make the first one the how it works. Then the mailed section should be the next navigation item. Then the testimonials, and then the pricing section. And that's actually it. So that's all that we have to do here. So let's quickly finish that, going back all the way to the top. So how it works. Mails. Then the testimonials. Pricing. And then here, of course, finally, our call to action. Now, I'm not going to use the same text here, which was start eating well, because that's too repetitive and also the text is too long. So here, let's try something simpler. So just try for free. Okay. And so that looks a lot more natural now with the real content. And so now, in fact, we are done here. So great job, and make sure that you really study this project, that you understand all the code, and only then move on to our next section where we will then make this project responsive. So take a break here because you really deserve it. And then afterwards, let's go together to the next section.